So why don't we go ahead and get started? My name is Apurva Samaya Zulu. I use she and her pronouns. I'm a program manager with CORE and a member of the Data for Change team. And I'm here with my colleague, Sarah. Sarah, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Morning, everyone. Excited to be with you here today. My name is Sarah Roth. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a research scientist here at CORE.
And we wanted to welcome you to our August webinar on storytelling with data. Thank you all for being here today. And we can go ahead and dive into our webinar objectives. So these are the main goals. This is what we want you to walk away from today with a clearer understanding of. And the three main points are why use storytelling, learn how to tailor your story for different audiences and why that's important, and understand what it means to tell a story with data. So for our agenda today, we'll start with a brief welcome. These are the slides that we normally do at the beginning of these webinars. Then we'll dive into the content, so covering what is storytelling with data, understanding your audience, talking a little bit about the various story elements. Today we'll be covering data, narrative, and visualizations. And finally, we'll be talking about how to bring it all together.
Great. Thank you so much, Apurva. We're really excited to be talking with folks today about data storytelling. So at the heart of all the work our organization does, and often the work that your organizations do around collecting, analyzing, and sharing data, there's often the goal of motivating action. So you're using your data to get a funder to fund. You might be using data to help recruit new volunteers to start a new program. And you might also be using data to improve the way that your programs operate and meet the needs of the communities that you serve. So leveraging a storytelling framework can really help distill the data that you've collected and the message that you're pairing with that data into action, right? It can really help turn that data into a next step. And stories are really important for connecting data and visualizations to action through providing additional context and emotion for the data that you're sharing. So today we're going to talk through the three components or the three steps of building a data story. And if you've spent any time with the Data for Change team, you'll know often that first step is really understanding, familiarizing yourself, analyzing, assessing the data that you have on hand. And really having a clear understanding of that data will allow you to build a clear narrative that you want to construct that you'll use to construct your point of view for the story. And that narrative will be the place where you're communicating the insights that you've learned from the data with the context of where the data are coming from. Then using the data that you've collected and the narrative and sort of like that next step that you have in mind, you can use clear, simple data visualizations that will support the narrative and the action that you want to convey. And putting all of these pieces together is what we would call your data story. So why do we think you should tell stories? So according to the Neuro Leadership Institute, when we see or hear a story, the neurons in our brain fire in the same pattern as the speakers. And this process releases dopamine. It makes us happy. It makes us, it gives us emotion. And that makes it more likely for us to remember the experience with a greater level of accuracy. And you can think about this, right? Like at a base level, we really know this. Like if we think about organizations' annual reports, people will often include client success stories with pictures alongside, the data, the impact infographics, to really make that story share that narrative in like a compelling, emotional way. And having a better understanding of the people who make up your data and their day-to-day lives gives all of your numbers, all of your data a richer, more nuanced meeting. So one sort of pause just to keep it from me yammering on the whole time or before in the activity, you could share a time when you heard a data story that convinced you. What made it convincing and what stood out. And I can share, for me, when I was thinking about this question, it wasn't so much of a presentation, but the Matthew Desmond book about eviction, I think it's called Evicted. He does an amazing job of comparing sort of like the things we know about housing stability and some in-depth ethnography work that he did. And that's a story where he did a good job of pairing narrative and sort of like quantitative numbers to really tell a compelling story about housing stability. So feel free to drop those in the chat if you have another example. And again, data storytelling is just a useful framework that answer many of the common questions that come up in organizations kind of day to day when they're thinking about their data. So what do we know about our participants? What is the impact of our programs? And what would help us reach our sort of mission and goals of our organization? And importantly, I think the real useful aspect of data storytelling is leveraging those data or leveraging the answers of those questions in a way that's useful for building a compelling case to advocate for your community. So it's really sort of answering those questions, but answering them in a way that, you know, conveys emotion and spurs action. There are lots of different venues for data storytelling. You can think about audiences outside of your organizations. Oftentimes, people are interested in talking with funders and convincing funders. People want to connect, you know, with like their participant or the communities that they're serving. And maybe you're wanting to coordinate or kind of like collaborate action among peer organizations or partner organizations. Within the community that you're serving. And it can also be really important to use this like data storytelling format or structure with internal audiences. Often you're wanting to sort of inform executive leadership of decisions that you think are important or changes that you feel like are important. You might be talking to your board of trustees or your board of directors, and even for talking to staff about things that are important. If there's an important data point that you want to share, using a data storytelling framework can help make that call to action more compelling. And I'll turn it back over to Apoorva.
So we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about what it means to understand your audience, starting with why tailor your story to the audience. So the audience that you're speaking to is really the heart of any storytelling effort. Understanding what their priorities are, you know, what they're most concerned with and what their goals are, will help you tailor your story to meet their needs, and that'll make it more likely for you to align with them and for them to feel aligned with you and thus achieve your objective and desired outcomes. So we really do want to spend a little bit of time upfront before we dig into like how to build a narrative to understand what makes your audience tick. And we do that by first talking about who is the audience. Because for each of these different groups, we'll be tailoring our approach and thinking about different ways that'll engage them on the level that they are interested in. So if your audience is community members, you're going to want to make sure that you're showing them that your values are aligned, that you're understanding what the community identified needs and priorities are, and that your organization, your program, your initiative is aligned with that. So to do that, you might provide examples or anecdotes, share stories of community members who were impacted by your initiative, and also integrate the community-driven priorities throughout the story that you're telling. When speaking to managers, you're going to want to be exhaustive and informative. Show that you've done your homework and that you have thought about all the contingencies. Address the resources required, talk about things like that effort and impact matrix, and think about funding. And also provide appendices or resources. Show that you've thought through all these possibilities, and so when they have questions, they can just refer back to the materials that you put together. For executives, oftentimes you won't get a lot of time on their agenda, so you want to be brief and be rigorous. Talk about the things that are most impactful to that level. That might be things like risk, cost, and landscape. And also provide some materials for asynchronous review. That might be a slide that you send out beforehand or a leave behind. That way, when you walk away, they still have something that they can refer back to that's clear and succinct and gets your point across. And when thinking about funders as your audience, you want to be thorough and you want to show your value. By value, I mean, what does your program do better than anyone? What makes you unique and what sets you apart? So address funder priorities, know what they're interested in, but also show your strategy and your vision and how those things align. So we've talked a bit about how to tailor your content to various groups, but on an individual level, every person is going to engage with your content in different ways. Some people really love pouring through data and diving into details. So if you share a bunch of data up front, they may get distracted and look at those figures rather than engage with the story that you're trying to tell. Data can also be intimidating to some people. So if you share too much too fast, they may get overwhelmed and disengage from your story entirely. So the trick is really understanding the right amount of detail to share that gets your point across and presents a balanced and fair picture without distracting or overwhelming your audience. You also want to think about what kinds of stories your audience will connect with. Is that anecdotes? Is that stories about clients or from clients? Is that feedback from maybe client feedback surveys? Is that facts and statistics from those surveys? Or is it illustrations? Would it be visualizations or pictures that really help drive home the story that you're trying to tell? And finally, think about what you want your audience to do. We'll spend a little bit more time talking about this later today, but it's helpful to think about what your goal is up front so you can build your story around that and ensure that you're driving home those points so your audience walks away with a clear understanding of what it is they're going to do with the information you provided.
So we have done a lot of webinars on data in the past as the data part of the Data for Change team. So I'm just gonna spend just a couple of slides talking about this data element. But you want to first and foremost make sure your data story is valuable. So every compelling story begins with strong data foundation. If your data are incomplete, inaccurate, or irrelevant, your story falls apart, right? There's always I think we commonly say like garbage in, garbage out. So you want to make sure that you have time to review and analyze the data that you have in relation to the question that you're trying to answer. And I think one thing to flag here for folks is that it can be tempting to sort of like have the narrative ahead of like in advance and sort of cherry pick the data to tell the story that like you think is the most important story. And there's just kind of a balance of like making sure that your data sort of collectively support the story that you're trying to tell. So try to remain as balanced as you can in your analysis and thinking through certain data sets and certain data points to look at the whole picture and tell sort of a solid story. And this is just kind of like how we often think about bucketing our data questions, right? So we're often sort of, when we're doing research or evaluation or thinking about our data, we kind of put them into two groups. Sometimes we're thinking about what we would call like implementation questions. So like, how are our programs meeting the needs of the people that we are serving? And how can we improve outreach or adjust programs or adjust strategies to better meet the needs of the community? And then there are often data questions we have, or stories we want to tell around a program impact. And so those might be more like evaluation questions. What things change as a result of the work that we're doing in the community? And so depending on the types of questions you want to answer, you will need different types of data. So oftentimes when we're thinking about kind of those those like how is our program success, we're thinking about client feedback surveys, or we're thinking about staff listening sessions with our frontline staff who are directly serving clients. So things like that, like how are the processes working? Are there different programs or different needs that are emerging in the community, and how can we adjust our services to better meet those needs? When we're thinking about program impact, we're often thinking about maybe a client intake form as a baseline, types of annual or exit surveys that people are taking once they leave our programs, any sort of like follow-up or closed loop referrals that are happening, kind of like where do people land, or where are they, how are their needs after they've been in our programs. And tools like logic models and data inventories can really help map out which indicators or measures can be prioritized in answering these questions, and where you might be able to pull relevant data to answer the questions that you're trying to answer.
The next part is of that diagram we had data, narrative, and visual. So now we're going to be talking a little bit about that narrative section, starting with narrative structure, which is on the next slide. So this is something that you might have seen before. We talked about this in grade school when we were learning how to write stories, but there's three real pieces to the narrative structure. So there's the setting, where you set the scene by providing context and background information, and this is where you start to build tension. You have the conflict, which is where you describe the core issue as either a problem or an opportunity. This is where the tension is rising, and the climax is the point where the conflict is explained and the tension is highest. Then you start to sort of lessen the tension and let that fall as you discuss the resolution, which is the solution or the course of action that you propose that people take. So you have that setting, conflict, and resolution, but you really want to work with that tension, as that is what creates that intrigue and engagement and makes a story more exciting and engaging for the listener. And then on the next slide, we have types of narrative structures. So there's a chronological structure. This is really that sort of, you start at the beginning, you take that step-by-step approach. You say, this is where we began, this is what we did next, this is what we did after that, and this is what we're going to do in the future. And then there's the call to action structure. This is where you lead with what's called a big idea, and you explain to the audience how they can make it happen. And we're going to spend a little bit of time today talking about what a big idea is. And you can learn a little bit more about these types of narrative structures from the book Storytelling with Data by Cole Nussbaumer-Knaflic. But that big idea concept comes from a different book that we're going to talk about in the next slide. So this comes from the book Data Story by Nancy Duarte. And she just defines a big idea as your point of view plus the stakes. And then you create a sentence with a verb in it, and that's your big idea. So your point of view is essentially, you think about what is your particular view on the subject? What idea are you trying to convince people to adopt? And what perspective are you trying to form? Then you think about the stakes, right? That is, what happens if people accept your point of view and act upon it? And what are the negative consequences of inaction? And you put those two together in one sentence, and that's your big idea. It's a pretty simple framework, and it makes it a really powerful way to sort of frame a story. Next slide, please. So this is how to build your big idea. She calls this a data point of view in that data story book. And the data point of view combines these two elements. So what action needs to be taken and what is at stake. So an example of what a data point of view or big idea might be, the funding from this grant will expand our transitional housing program and eliminate the waitlist, providing housing for 40% more participants. So we know that's a data point of view because we know what action needs to be taken, right? We need the funding from this grant. And then we know what's at stake. If this grant is funded, we can eliminate the waitlist for this program and provide housing for 40% more participants. That way the audience knows what they need to do and what happens if they do it or they don't do it. An example that's not a data point of view, this grant will help expand our transitional housing program. While the audience may know, okay, so the grant will help, they have no idea what happens if they fund it or if they don't fund it. So it's a little bit less compelling, and it gives them less context for the decision that they have to make. So once you have your data point of view, you can put that together in your story using a recommendation tree. And this is a sort of brief outline of how to build a recommendation tree. So you take your big idea and then you come up with some supporting points. You want the supporting points to address what needs to be done, why is it important, and how you'll accomplish it. And for each of those supporting points, you're going to want to come up with points of evidence, and that's where that data comes in. So an example is using that example that we used before. So the funding from this grant will expand our transitional housing program and eliminate the waitlist, providing housing for 40% more participants. So the supporting point, the first one, is transitional housing improves access to stable housing. What's the evidence for that? Well, 80% of our transitional housing program participants have become stably housed within 2 years. And there's been a 50% increase in the number of unhoused and unstably housed individuals in the region over the past 5 years. So with those two pieces of evidence, we know that it's important because there's a population need for it, and we know that it accomplishes the goal because participants become stably housed. For the second supporting point, we say there's a high need for housing support in this service area. So the pieces of evidence are there's a 40% increase in our waitlist for transitional housing, and participant feedback lists housing as their number one priority. So we know there's a need because participants say that it's important to them, and we know there's a need because our waitlist is expanding and people are asking for the service. Now we're going to get into a little bit of an activity. So starting with a reflection, and we want you to think about formulating your big idea based on what we just talked about. So take by yourself, just silently reflect on a time when you had to present an idea, a course of action, or an opportunity. Think about the story that you told back then, and then based on what we just talked about, this big idea framework, put it into a big idea format and spend about 5 minutes thinking about this. We put some examples on the screen just so you can have a point of reference. The first one is that kind of external example that we just used, that grant for the transitional housing program. The second example is maybe more internal or operationally focused. Creating a pickup site for food pantry participants so they can pick up boxes will increase the number of people utilizing pantry services by 30%. So you're asking your organization to create a pickup site, and you're saying that what that'll do is it'll increase the number of people utilizing pantry services. So whether it's external or internal, take 5 minutes by yourself to come up with a sort of big idea based on an example you've had from the past or something that you're working on right now. So thank you all for participating in the breakout room. I know we can always use a little bit more time discussing in groups, but I learned a lot from, I think, the examples shared. And I think one of the things that we talked about was how do we tell the story in a way that's continually engaging multiple partners. And that's some of what this is too, right? Like, how do you make a story memorable and engaging? And one of the tips is use repetition. So tell your audience what you're going to tell them your big idea, and then remind them of what you told them. This really helps sort of set up what the point you're trying to make is and help them remember it when they walk away as well. Another tip for engaging audiences is using anecdotes and quotes to kind of humanize the data and make abstract ideas more tangible. And this is something that came up a couple of times in the group as well. How do you put together the qualitative and the quantitative to tell a good story? So one thing that you can do is use, quotes from clients or quotes from their client feedback surveys. So this is an example comment from a client feedback survey that might be a supporting point to the example that we've been using about the transitional housing program. So this client said, the transitional housing program was a lifeline that allowed me to keep my job and empowered me to get my own place. Words like lifeline and empowered are so impactful to hear as an audience member or a listener. It really drives home the emotional part of the story and how it made the client feel, as well as sharing what the actual impact of the program was. So being on the lookout for words that kind of drive that human element and draw that emotional angle will help people remember your story and understand the impact of what it is you're trying to share. The other piece is you want your call to action to be clear. You want your audience to walk away from your story knowing exactly what they're going to do with the information that you provided. So the two ways to do that are, one, make your ask very clear, and two, make it easy for them to follow through. So if you want your audience member to approve a plan, you should provide them with the desired outcomes and the next steps that they're going to take. If you want your audience to make a decision, you tell them the criteria that they'll use to make that decision. And if you want your audience to share information elsewhere, you'll tell them exactly where it is you want them to take that information and share it. The next slide has some examples for what that might look like. So you want your audience to approve a plan. Your outcome might be, so we're asking you to reallocate 3 food pantry staff for a drive-through food box pickup zone so participants can conveniently access services. The outcome, participants will conveniently access services. The next step for the audience, reallocate 3 food pantry staff. So you've made it clear what you want them to do and how they can do it. If you want your audience to make a decision, the example is, we are asking you to approve this economic development grant so our small business development program can support minority-owned businesses in the community. So the criteria that they're going to use is minority-owned businesses. Is that something that's relevant or important or central to our program, and how it therefore should we fund it? You want your audience to share information, you should tell them the audience for dissemination. So the example is, we are asking you to present this opportunity analysis to the Board of Trustees to make informed decisions about new partnerships. So the audience is the Board of Trustees, and the reason that's the audience is because they have the power to make informed decisions about new partnerships. So for an optional activity, using the big idea that you came up with and then shared in your small groups, develop a quick call to action and drop that in the chat.
So the last part of telling a data story can be employing visuals to your story to really help bring it all together. So if you think about your favorite books from childhood, the pictures are often integral to the stories that you love. And the same can be really true with data storytelling. Data visualizations help turn complex data into something your audience can easily interpret. The example below shows the same set of data in 2 different formats. One of them is a table, and one of them is a heat map. And the example of the heat map really shows much more clearly and right away, you can see that relationship between the sense of belonging scores and housing status. And when you're thinking about data visualizations, we often end in like the charts and graphs and diagrams area, but you can even think about short videos that might just really help clarify patterns, highlight changes, or emphasize contrasts. We've done a couple of webinars, which are linked down here below, previously on data visualization, but the most important thing that we wanted to talk about today, especially with relation to data storytelling, was just the idea of keeping things simple. Simple, commonly used charts are going to be your best tools when thinking about data storytelling. So more complex visuals may look impressive, but they really add mental labor and again will pull the attention away from the key insights that you're trying to make. You don't want your audience to spend their energy interpreting a chart instead of hearing your point of view and your big takeaway. You want to choose charts like bar charts, pie or donut charts, or line charts that everyone can very easily read and understand. And another point that we often talk about a lot with our data visualizations is really using the title and a quick observation to highlight the important information that you want people to walk away with. So you can be really strategic in including a clear title on your visuals that offers the context of the data. So what the data are, when were they collected, and how, like what measures are you using in the data. And then you can include a descriptive observation that emphasizes the important information that connects to the narrative or to your ask that you want your audience to sort of understand about the data that you're showing them.
The final section of today is putting all these pieces that we've talked about together. So we'll return to this visual that we shared at the beginning, the part that storytelling is sort of at the center of data, narrative, and visuals, and that's putting it all together. So data storytelling is how we move from making sense of data through analytical processes to making meaning of data through action. And that's really the takeaway that we want to share today. So storytelling is how you drive people to make change, how you drive action, and how you spur people or inspire people to make that action. So putting together all the pieces that we discussed, start with your big idea, show the evidence base, and end with your call to action. So starting with your big idea means leading the presentation with your point of view. That's really what you want people to do and why they should do it. Showing the evidence base means pulling that data that pulling curated data that shows the current need and the opportunity, doing that data analysis upfront and knowing what you need to support your story, and developing visuals that speak to the audience and support the narrative that you're trying to build. And ending with your call to action means leaving your audience with a clear take-home message so they know exactly what they're going to do with what you told them today. So telling your story to the community is something that we hear about a lot as something that's important to folks. And when telling your story to the community, think about framing it as a big idea. When you think about, what goes into that big idea, what action must be taken, it might become, what are you hoping the audience will do? And the stakes are what makes it valuable to them. So what are you looking for with community engagement? Is it, interest from volunteers, new participants, sharing successes? If it's program participants, the action would be, what do you want your participants to do? Do you want them to provide input on your program? Do you want them to refer others to your program? So the stakes would then become, how do you as a program center your client needs? And how do you use data to improve services? So the channels that you might employ to tell the story would be simple infographics. Just use one or two data points or data parties that make it easy for people to engage. You want this to be shareable and simple and easy for program participants to understand and then share with others to tell that story. If you're telling the story to individual donors or volunteers, you want to think about the action as, what is your call to action for the individual? So do you want them to donate? Do you want them to volunteer? Do you want them to be an advocate for your program or tell that advocate somewhere else? So the stakes would be thinking about what your volunteers contribute. What do they get to do and how do they impact your program? And thinking about how your organization impacts the community. So some channels for sharing this story might be blog posts, newsletters, and social media. This makes it really easy for people to share your story elsewhere, to read more long form content, and also get individual stories. This might be program successes or things about individual clients that have stories to tell. So being able to use social media as an avenue for this would be really helpful. And finally, thinking about funders. What is your call to action for the funder? Do you want them to fund a program or a grant? Do you want them to advocate for you? So the stakes here would be thinking about what makes your organization unique. Really think about what you do better than anyone and what your role in the community is. So some channels to share this story might be an annual report, an executive summary, or a presentation. We really love the idea of an annual report because it's kind of a longer form way of telling all the stories that you collect over the course of a year, all the various successes that your program has and the things that you've been able to do. And people are able to read through and pick out what's relevant to them or what aligns with their values and then use that as support to advocate for you or fund you or whatever the goal might be. But really thinking about the method you use to share the story, more than just a presentation, ways that people can also tell your story elsewhere and really be a champion for you and your program. So some key takeaways from today. This is what we hope you walk away with understanding of. So data storytelling makes it easier for you to share what is important and for audiences to focus on your point. You can build a clear, big idea by describing what is at stake and what action should be taken. You want to build your data stories on a solid foundation of data collection and analysis, and you can enhance your data stories with simple, clear data visuals. And you can use data storytelling internally to advocate for ideas, improvements, or opportunities, and externally to highlight the value of your programs. That's all of our content for today. We want to leave some time at the end for questions in case anyone has anything that's come up. And we also